All right, get comfortable. Tonight, we're not talking about a great thinker or a mighty conqueror. No, tonight's story begins with something far more unassuming. A plant. A plant that has been healing, confusing, and mildly irritating governments for thousands of years. Cannabis. Before we begin, feel free to make yourself cozy. Maybe dim the lights, switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and settle in. We're heading way back, roughly 5000 BC, the Stone Age. And yes, emphasis on stone. Civilization is still in beta testing. People are figuring out pottery, taming animals, and occasionally dying from standing too close to a mosquito. It was a different time. Somewhere in what's now Siberia, a forager probably tossed a handful of cannabis onto a campfire just to keep warm. They inhaled the smoke, paused, and immediately forgot why they went outside in the first place. Archaeologists later found cannabis seeds in burial sites from that era. Clearly, someone thought the plant was important enough to take to the afterlife. Was it part of a sacred ritual, or just a prehistoric version of "don't bury me without my stash"? Honestly, knowing humans, probably both. At the start, cannabis wasn't about relaxation or deep thoughts. It was about survival. Its fibers became ropes and clothes. Its seeds were food. It was essentially the Stone Age version of a Swiss Army knife. You could build boats with it, tie things together, wear it, and, if you accidentally burned it, find the clouds above you suddenly hilarious. Imagine being one of the first people to intentionally breathe it in. There's no one to explain what's happening. No snacks waiting in the kitchen. No Bob Marley playing softly in the background. Just confusion. And a very long, one-sided conversation with a tree. Early humans probably didn't think they were getting high. They likely assumed the gods had just upgraded their vision. And yet, from that accidental puff, a legend was born. This plant would one day travel across continents, inspire poetry, cause more than a few bouts of paranoia, and fund entire reggae albums. All thanks to some bored Neolithic farmer who decided to see what would happen if he set fire to his crops. Before the word weed even existed, cannabis had already outsmarted us. It found the one species willing to grow it, worship it, outlaw it, and smoke it, sometimes all within the same century. Humanity, meet one of your oldest love-hate relationships. Let's fast forward to around 2700 BCE. China is inventing pretty much everything: paper, silk, bureaucracy, and, apparently, issuing the world's first medical endorsement for getting high. Enter Emperor Shennong, known as the Divine Farmer. Sounds noble, but in practice it meant he spent much of his reign taste-testing random plants to see which ones wouldn't kill him. Think of him as the world's first clinical trial, without a control group. According to legend, Shennong identified hundreds of herbs this way, including ginseng tea and, yes, cannabis. His book, the Pensao Ching, reads a bit like an ancient Yelp for plants. Good for pain, gout, rheumatism, and forgetfulness. Which is quite impressive considering cannabis was likely causing some of that forgetfulness in the first place. For Shen Nong, cannabis wasn't a vice. It was medicine. The Chinese didn't roll it up or pass it around. They brewed it into tonics, ground it into powders, and probably gave it names like Wind in the Bones Elixir. It eased fevers, soothed nerves, and made people just a touch too confident in their poetry. By this point, hemp was everywhere. It was spun into ropes, woven into clothes, written on as paper. You could live your entire life surrounded by the same plant, from your tunic to your fishing nets, even your reading material. It was like living inside a very eco-friendly bong. Doctors in ancient China took cannabis seriously. They believed it balanced the body's yin and yang, which is a poetic way of saying it chills you out. It wasn't recreational yet, but let's be honest. Every culture that claims something is purely for spiritual healing usually ends up laughing at shadows eventually. While much of the world was still busy discovering fire pits and making regrettable choices, China had already added cannabis to its official pharmacy. Shen Nong didn't know about THC, but he did know one crucial thing. It made people stop complaining for a while. And in a world full of floods, famines, and Mongols warming up in the distance, that was a pretty significant medical breakthrough. While China was busy boiling cannabis into tonics and insisting it was all very medicinal, their neighbors out on the endless grasslands of Central Asia had a far less complicated plan. Just burn it and breathe deeply. Enter the Scythians, nomadic horse riders who essentially lived outdoors, wore fur like it was a personality trait, and carried themselves with the relaxed confidence of people who were always armed. Around 1000 BCE, these fierce wanderers decided their funeral rituals were missing a little something. Not incense, not sage, cannabis. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us that the Scythians would toss hemp seeds onto hot stones inside sealed tents. Within moments, the space filled with thick, fragrant clouds, and, in his words, they would howl with pleasure, which is ancient Greek for someone's about to freestyle under the stars. And this wasn't just a polite ceremonial puff. It was more like a full-body baptism in THC. Picture 20 tattooed warriors, wrapped in animal skins, crawling into a tent thick with smoke, and stumbling out afterward looking both spiritually renewed and slightly unsure which way the horses were parked. For the Scythians, the smoke wasn't a party trick. It was sacred. It connected them to the spirits of the dead, eased their grief, and, if we're honest, probably made the afterlife sound like a pretty great upgrade. Archaeologists have even unearthed golden bongs from Scythian tombs. Yes, actual gold, still coated with traces of cannabis. These people didn't just get high. They got high with style. Their approach spread. From Persia to India, nomads, mystics, and anyone with access to fire started inhaling cannabis smoke during funerals, festivals, and deep philosophical debates. Because, let's face it, pondering the meaning of life goes a lot smoother when the air itself is contributing ideas. While the Chinese were busy writing about balance and brewing their medicine, the Scythians were perfecting the world's earliest hotbox. No fancy rituals, no chanting, just a fire, some seeds, and a collective understanding that nobody opens the tent flap until at least one person starts seeing gods. Meanwhile, farther south, India decided that if you're going to inhale smoke and glimpse the divine, you might as well make it sound respectable. So, around 1500 BCE, cannabis made its grand debut in the Atharva Veda, one of Hinduism's 4 sacred texts. It was listed as one of 5 holy plants, a literal gift from the gods, specifically Shiva, who, according to legend, discovered cannabis beneath a celestial tree, took a few hits, and entered a state of cosmic tranquility. From that day on, Shiva became known as the Lord of Bhang, which, let's be honest, is one of the best religious titles in history. Bhang wasn't smoked, it was sipped. Imagine a creamy drink made with milk, spices, crushed cannabis leaves, and a generous swirl of promised enlightenment. Priests, yogis, and festival goers would drink it during ceremonies, chant praises to the gods, and occasionally forget mid-sentence what exactly they were praising. In India, cannabis wasn't rebellious. It wasn't illegal. It was holy. Temples used it to purify the spirit. Villagers used it to survive family gatherings. It was medicine, meditation, and mild escape, all in one convenient leaf. Festivals like Mahashivaratri turned into all-night spiritual celebrations, with worshippers singing hymns, dancing, and drinking bhang until they could practically see the universe vibrating. If enlightenment had a recipe, it would be 1 part devotion, 1 part weed, and 1 part inevitable morning after headache. Unlike other cultures, which treated cannabis mainly as a tool or trade good, India gave it a personality, playful, spiritual, and deeply human. It wasn't just a plant, it was a companion on the journey to understanding the universe, or at least pretending to. No one hid behind the excuse of, "It's for my joints." It was openly for joy, transcendence, and occasionally forgetting that the next decade might bring another drought. While the rest of the world was coughing inside smoky tents, India elevated cannabis to divine status. They didn't just smoke it, they deified it. Here, getting high wasn't escapism, it was enlightenment with better snacks. Meanwhile, back in China, things were taking a more bureaucratic turn. Because in China, even spiritual awakening came with proper documentation. By around 1000 BCE, cannabis had woven itself into Taoist ritual life, a world of meditation, alchemy, and the occasional attempt to achieve immortality by doing very strange things in caves. Taoist monks believed that burning cannabis as incense allowed them to communicate with spirits and glimpse the future. And, to be fair, if you've ever experienced something similar, the first 10 minutes probably felt like the universe was putting on a spectacular light show, followed by 2 hours of questioning every life choice you've ever made. In Taoist texts, cannabis was sometimes called the liberator of sin, a poetic title that sounded uplifting, though it occasionally led people to wander into forests trying to hug clouds. During meditation, monks would burn the herb to open the gates of perception. In more modern terms, they got high enough to hear their own heartbeat in stereo. China's relationship with cannabis was never about wild parties, it was philosophical. The Taoists weren't trying to escape reality, they were trying to merge with it, essentially to get high enough to consider the universe their roommate. But, in classic Chinese fashion, it was all done with careful organization. Cannabis was measured precisely, mixed with other herbs, and documented in scrolls that likely carried a faint aroma of smoke and mild regret. You didn't just light up on a whim. There was a procedure, some chanting, and a very real possibility of accidentally levitating into a wall if you weren't careful. Meanwhile, the Confucians, ever the stern voices at the party, disapproved of anything that loosened the mind too much. Taoists said cannabis expanded consciousness. Confucians said it expanded laziness. And just like every drug policy debate that would follow throughout history, it ended with everyone politely agreeing in public, then doing whatever they wanted behind closed doors. Through it all, cannabis remained the quiet companion of China's mystics, burned in temples, studied by scholars, and almost certainly blamed for at least one lost manuscript. Only in ancient China could inhaling the cosmos require filling out the correct paperwork first. By this point, cannabis had earned its place in civilization, not just as a mystical herb or a suspicious vice, but as the ultimate overachiever, the Swiss Army knife of the ancient world. You could smoke it, wear it, write on it, build with it, and, if times got desperate, eat it. Hemp was everywhere. Fields of it stretched across the countryside. Villagers spun its fibers into thread, and scribes turned it into paper. The earliest texts of human history were written on hemp, meaning civilization itself was literally recorded on weed. Somewhere, a Taoist monk was likely inhaling the same plant another monk was using to write, "Stop inhaling this." Hemp's fibers were famously strong, durable, and resistant to decay. They held up fishing nets, tied ships together, and occasionally restrained overenthusiastic philosophers who had overindulged in the other half of the plant. Hemp clothing outlasted marriages, sandals were made to trek through history, and even armor padding was crafted from it, because nothing says battle ready quite like being dressed head to toe in cannabis. As the plant spread west along ancient trade routes, it conquered new lands without ever raising a leaf. The Persians wove it into ropes, the Egyptians brewed it into ointments, and the Greeks, predictably, debated its moral implications over wine. everyone used hemp. Everyone needed it, and everyone politely ignored how suspiciously cheerful their weavers looked all the time. Hemp had become a quiet empire builder. It didn't need armies or weapons. It offered strength, flexibility, and a subtle earthy scent that lingered for centuries. While kings fought over gold, hemp simply waited patiently in the background for humanity to remember what it could do. And eventually, humanity did remember. Not for rope, not for scrolls, but for smoke. The era of purely practical use was ending. A new age was dawning, the age of recreational enlightenment. By the time cannabis drifted into ancient Persia, it had already been medicine, rope, and incense. The Persians looked at this miraculous plant, and being Persians, decided it should probably teach them something about the universe. Because in this part of the world, even getting high came with a reading list. The Assyrians were among the first to make cannabis a regular part of spiritual life. They called it konubu, which, yes, sounds suspiciously like cannabis because it basically is. They burned it in temples, not for fun, but for divine insight, which is ancient priestly language for, "We're about to smell colors." When the plant made its way into Persia, it quickly found an enthusiastic audience among Zoroastrian mystics. These were people who already had fire altars, cosmic dualism, and a healthy dose of existential dread. All they were missing was a mood enhancer. They believed the smoke carried prayers to the heavens, and, to be fair, it did, along with a few brain cells. Then came the philosophers. Persia had no shortage of people who enjoyed sitting cross-legged and debating metaphysics until everyone forgot what the original question was. Cannabis fit right in. It eased pain, softened the edges of reality, and made long discussions about the nature of truth not only bearable but strangely profound. Some ancient accounts mention priests using it in rituals to free the mind from doubt. Modern translation: suddenly, everything made perfect sense. Of course, not everyone approved. Once the ruling class caught wind of the idea, panic set in. If people could reach divine insight without paying temple fees, the whole system might collapse. And so began cannabis's long, complicated public relations career, respected in private, condemned in public, and quietly passed around behind the incense burner. Persian traders helped spread it further west along the Silk Road. As it traveled, cannabis picked up new names, new rituals, and a growing reputation for stirring up philosophical mischief. By the time it reached Greece, it wasn't just a plant anymore. It was a traveling idea, a portable enlightenment kit with absolutely no instructions. Persia had taken cannabis and turned smoke into spirit, contemplation into a contact sport, and a humble plant into a debate partner. And like most great philosophical conversations, it usually ended with someone saying, "Wait, what were we talking about again?" When cannabis drifted down the Nile, it encountered a civilization that ran on divine bureaucracy. The Egyptian gods had job titles, the priests had paperwork, and everyone else was busy building pyramids without a single labor law in sight. Into this world came cannabis, a small green mercy for a society that had been overworked for about 3 millennia. The Egyptians, ever practical, didn't host smoke-filled rituals like the Scythians, nor did they drink bhang milkshakes like in India. They used cannabis medically, which in practice meant they called it medicine and then applied it to absolutely everything. It appears in the Ebers Papyrus, a 500-year-old medical text listing cannabis as a treatment for inflammation, glaucoma, menstrual pain, and wonderfully bad temper. That last one alone could have saved a few pharaohs from unnecessary wars. Priests were the main gatekeepers of cannabis use. They mixed it into balms, oils, and incense for temple rituals. Picture a high priest swinging a censer full of fragrant smoke, insisting it's purely spiritual. Sure. And so is tequila. The idea was that the sweet smoke would carry prayers to the gods and probably made everyone in the temple feel a little closer to them. Cannabis even followed people into the afterlife. Traces have been found in mummy wrappings and burial chambers, proof that someone once thought, if I'm heading into eternity, I'm bringing a joint. Hard to argue with that logic. Eternity sounds long, and the afterlife reportedly involved more farming. Women used it too. Ancient Egyptian midwives prescribed cannabis to ease childbirth pain. A brave move in a world without epidurals, where your only relief options were divine chanting and whatever herbs you managed to sneak past the priest. You can almost hear the advice, breathe, my queen, and pass the oil. Even the nobility joined in. Pharaohs, fond of luxury but plagued by responsibilities, used cannabis ointments to soothe royal migraines, likely caused by the crushing weight of their crowns or the endless meetings about pyramid deadlines. In short, the Egyptians didn't just build monuments, they built coping mechanisms. Cannabis wasn't rebellion, it was survival. When your gods demand perfection, your climate demands sweat, and your workforce keeps fainting in the sun, a humble green plant starts to look a lot like divine intervention. By the time cannabis reached ancient Greece, it found a culture already deeply committed to two national pastimes: arguing and drinking. Naturally, a plant that encouraged both introspection and a touch of chaos fit right in. The Greeks didn't invent cannabis use, they just intellectualized it. To them, nothing was truly sacred until it had been debated, categorized, and turned into a symposium topic. And so began the philosophical relationship between weed and wisdom, or, as Plato might have called it, the Republic of Chill. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Dioscorides wrote about cannabis in their medical texts, praising its ability to treat inflammation, earaches, and pains of the inner self, which might just be history's first recorded case of existential dread. They weren't exactly rolling joints under the Acropolis, but cannabis definitely had a quiet presence in Greece, probably discussed in that overly serious, everything is profound symposium tone. Picture it: a smoky hall, cups of wine, half a dozen philosophers lounging on couches, and someone casually dropping, "My friends, what if reality is an illusion?" Nods all around. A debate begins. Someone coughs in the corner because they took one too many experimental whiffs of medicinal incense. The Greeks didn't see cannabis as scandalous, just natural. It grew in the wild, healed aches, and occasionally provided the kind of clarity that could end friendships. Soldiers used hemp to treat wounds, while philosophers likely used it to wound logic. Everyone had their angle. Even Herodotus, the original ancient travel blogger, wrote admiringly of the Scythians and their joyful smoke rituals. The Greeks themselves were a bit like modern people who praise yoga retreats but never actually go. They admired the idea but liked to pretend they were above it. Not that Greek philosophers needed cannabis to think deeply. These were people who questioned everything: gods, laws, morality, and why sandals hurt so much. Cannabis simply gave those questions a softer edge, and occasionally made them feel even more profound. Somewhere in a quiet Athenian garden, while the city debated the meaning of virtue, a lesser-known philosopher probably stared at an olive tree for 2 hours and whispered, "I think it understands me." And honestly, that might be the most Greek thing that's ever happened. When the Romans arrived on the scene, they brought their usual policy: conquer people, and while you're at it, conquer their stuff too. Food, gods, languages, and of course, cannabis. The plant entered Rome quietly, along trade routes, and never really left. The Romans didn't worship it like the Indians, nor philosophize about it like the Greeks. They just used it, complained about it, wrote manuals on it. For Romans, cannabis was practical. Its fibers became ropes, sails, and tents, essentials for an empire that couldn't stop invading places. Hemp ropes pulled ships across the Mediterranean, tied prisoners together, and occasionally doubled as laundry lines for togas soaked in regret. If Rome had a motto, it might have been Veni, Vidi, Vaped. Roman doctors loved cannabis too. Dioscorides, the same Greek physician, now conveniently working under Roman branding, recommended it for earaches, gout, and joint pain, which, given the amount of marching, fighting, and extracurricular activities going on, was probably half the empire. Cannabis was also believed to reduce sexual desire, a prescription that no doubt made it instantly unpopular with the Senate. Roman women found other uses for it, infusing cannabis into beauty oils to soften their skin and ease, quote, female complaints. Considering Roman plumbing, cuisine, and public health standards, that might have been the nicest thing their bodies experienced all year. But don't picture toga-clad stoners lounging around the forum. For Romans, intoxication was a moral issue. Wine was civilized. Hashish was suspicious. Anything that made you too happy without taxation was a problem. Hemp was everywhere, but actually smoking it was left to foreigners, mystics, and that one uncle who wouldn't stop talking about the stars at family banquets. Even so, cannabis spread through the empire like gossip in a bathhouse. Roman soldiers carried hemp seeds to distant provinces, unintentionally transforming swaths of Europe into fertile ground for the world's most versatile weed. From Britain to North Africa, the plant took root quietly, persistently, like every idea Rome tried to suppress. While emperors toasted with wine and philosophers debated virtue, humble hemp was holding the empire together, literally. Ropes, sails, scrolls, remedies, all courtesy of a plant no one wanted to publicly admit they admired. Rome eventually fell, but cannabis didn't. It simply waited, green and patient, for the next empire to discover it. By the time the Silk Road reached its golden age, cannabis had accomplished what every empire dreamed of: total globalization without a single battle. No armies, no invasions. Just chill merchants spreading good vibes and better hemp. Picture it, a caravan winding slowly through the deserts of Central Asia. Camels groan, traders sweat, spices fill the air, and somewhere in the back there's a humble sack of cannabis seeds, labeled, of course, for medicinal purposes. It was the ancient equivalent of claiming something in your carry-on is definitely just vitamins. Along these trade routes, cannabis became a cultural shapeshifter. In China, it was medicine and paper. In India, it was sacred. In Persia, it became philosophy in smoke form. And by the time it reached the Middle East and Africa, it had transformed into hashish, portable, potent, and frankly, a lot more fun than most religions were prepared to allow. Merchants on the Silk Road weren't just swapping silk and spices. They were trading ideas, stories, and, occasionally, a lungful of aromatic smoke. You could hear Sanskrit hymns mixing with Persian poetry, while somewhere in the corner, someone accidentally reinvented hotboxing for the third time in history. Among the most famous Silk Road legends were the Assassins of Alamut, a secretive sect in Persia associated with hashish. According to European chroniclers, who were usually both nervous and biased, these assassins would get high before carrying out political killings. In reality, the truth is probably less dramatic. They enjoyed hashish and happened to be very efficient with daggers. But the legend stuck, and the Arabic hashashin eventually morphed into our modern word, assassin, a linguistic masterpiece born of paranoia and bad PR. Further west, Arab physicians studied cannabis carefully, writing about its ability to both lift melancholy and erode discipline, which, honestly, still sums it up quite well. Traders themselves learned a simple business truth. People will always pay extra for anything that makes them forget they're riding a camel for 9 months. The Silk Road turned cannabis into the world's first truly multicultural plant. It slipped across languages, religions, and moral codes with ease. Everyone pretended they were only using it for healing. But whether you were a monk in China, a merchant in Samarkand, or a mystic in Cairo, the scent was the same: smoke, dust, and mild enlightenment. Cannabis had gone ancient world viral, and there was no logging off. By the time the Islamic Golden Age arrived, cannabis had become the polite guest nobody admitted to inviting. But everyone let stay. From Baghdad to Cairo, it floated quietly through mosques, palaces, and poetry circles, rarely mentioned too loudly, but always present. The early Islamic world was a cultural supernova, inventing algebra, advancing astronomy, writing medical treatises, debating philosophy, and, somewhere in the background, enjoying a plant that made all of that just a little more interesting. Scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi wrote about cannabis in their medical works, describing it as useful for pain, digestion, and calming the spirit. Medieval doctors speak for, "Take one and stop arguing about theology for 5 minutes." But Islam's relationship with intoxication was complicated. The Quran forbade alcohol clearly, but it didn't say much about cannabis. And where there's interpretive gray area, humanity inevitably finds a loophole. Enter hashish, the original technically not forbidden substance. Sufi mystics embraced it wholeheartedly. These were the spiritual poets and dancers of Islam, spinning in circles, seeking union with the divine through music, prayer, and occasionally substances that made God seem unusually chatty. For the Sufis, cannabis wasn't a vice, it was a bridge, a fragrant, slightly giggly bridge to the divine. Meanwhile, the religious establishment was less amused. Hashish dens sprang up from Egypt to Persia, filled with scholars, merchants, and people who were definitely supposed to be somewhere else. Authorities labeled it a moral plague. Preachers called it the herb of idleness. Yet every crackdown faltered, largely because the enforcers had to confiscate suspiciously large quantities for quality control. By the 13th century, hashish had become the era's open secret. Poets praised it, rulers banned it, doctors prescribed it, and beggars smoked it. Everyone had an opinion, and half forgot what it was mid-sentence. While medieval Europe was busy burning witches and bathing occasionally, the Islamic world was holding lively debates over whether cannabis brought you closer to God or just closer to a very long nap. Either way, the outcome was clear: a civilization at the height of its creativity, and possibly just a little bit high while achieving it. Somewhere in the tangled mountains of 11th century Persia, cannabis met its first major PR disaster. The legend begins with a secretive sect called the Nizari Ismailis. These were the folks who built mountain fortresses, irritated empires, and occasionally removed political rivals in ways that were both creative and efficient. Their leader, Hassan-i Sabah, ruled from a fortress called Alamut, which translates to Eagle's Nest, because, understandably, Murder HQ wasn't great for neighborhood relations. According to medieval rumor, his followers, the Hashashin, would smoke hashish before assassinations, gliding through missions in a blissful haze of divine purpose. Chroniclers swore the drug made them fearless, devoted, and exceptionally stab-inclined. It's a dramatic story, and almost certainly nonsense. In reality, there's no evidence these men ever used hashish before missions. The myth was most likely crafted by their enemies, who, faced with the uncomfortable truth that a small mountain sect kept outsmarting entire empires, decided it was easier to say, "They're not geniuses, they're just high." It was medieval damage control at its finest. But gossip travels fast, especially when knights bring it home from crusades. European soldiers returned whispering tales of mystical Eastern killers intoxicated by strange herbs. The word hashashin twisted through languages until it became, quote, assassin. And just like that, a religion, a military tactic, and a plant fused into one sensational headline that would last for centuries. Ironically, the Nizari Ismailis were more scholars, engineers, and diplomats than bloodthirsty zealots. They built libraries, brokered treaties, and only resorted to killing when absolutely necessary, which, to be fair, was still fairly often. The idea that they got high before missions came from the same chroniclers who confidently reported dragons in Ethiopia. But the damage was done. Hashish was now forever linked to shadowy violence, not because of evidence, but thanks to medieval gossip and a global shortage of fact-checking. So next time you hear the word assassin, remember, it began as an exaggerated rumor about a group of bookish Persians who may or may not have enjoyed a bit of herbal incense after work. The castles eventually crumbled, the myth endured, and cannabis picked up a new reputation, from sacred plant to suspicious substance. And, as usual, humanity learned absolutely nothing. By the time cannabis reached medieval Europe, the continent already had a sophisticated system for dealing with new ideas. Fear them, ban them, then quietly use them anyway. Hemp had been a familiar presence for centuries. Rope, oil, fabric, even parchment. No one batted an eye. But the moment someone decided to light it instead of weave it, the church got involved. To be fair, medieval Europe wasn't exactly in the mood for experimentation. Between crusades, famines, and the occasional plague wiping out a third of the population, people were barely keeping it together. The church controlled everything: law, medicine, and your afterlife prospects. And it wasn't thrilled about substances that made peasants giggle during sermons. Still, cannabis slipped through the cracks. Monks grew hemp in monastery gardens to make parchment and prayer ropes, all while penning moral condemnations of sinful herbs. It's safe to assume at least one monk eventually sampled the goods and had a profound spiritual experience involving a candle flame and 37 Gregorian chants. By the 13th century, doctors and apothecaries were quietly prescribing cannabis oil for pain, fevers, and what they delicately called female complaints. It worked, which, naturally, made it suspicious. Anything that cured suffering without divine approval raised both eyebrows and torches. Miracles were supposed to come from heaven, not from the herb patch out back. Meanwhile, returning crusaders told wide-eyed stories of hashish dens in the east, dark rooms filled with relaxed people who, shockingly, weren't killing each other. European chroniclers described Saracens who smoke madness into their souls. Translation: they looked happy, which was clearly evil. It didn't take long for cannabis to join the ever-expanding list of things the church disapproved of: pagan rituals, heresy, women reading, and now, good moods. Officially, it was labeled the devil's herb. Unofficially, of course, cannabis never really left. Midwives, herbalists, and anyone with chronic back pain and a practical view of divine priorities kept using it quietly. And so Europe did what it does best. It took a versatile, fairly harmless plant and turned it into a moral crisis, a skill it has impressively preserved to this day. Hemp remained legal, but only as long as it behaved itself. The moment it suggested people might actually enjoy it, the church excommunicated it. Thus began one of Europe's longest-running traditions, being simultaneously terrified of and dependent on the very same thing. By the late Middle Ages, cannabis had accomplished what countless empires couldn't. It survived everything. Kingdoms rose and fell, languages evolved, entire civilizations burned, and the same scrappy green plant just kept growing wherever soil and human stress existed. Europe used hemp for absolutely everything: ropes, sails, paper, clothing. The age of exploration, in a very real sense, was powered by weed. Not the fun kind, but the kind that kept ships afloat. Columbus wouldn't have reached the Americas without hemp rigging, hemp caulking, and very possibly hemp underwear. In a strange twist of fate, cannabis accidentally helped discover the New World. Yet its reputation remained split. To the working class, it was a practical crop. To doctors, it was medicine. To the church, it was a convenient scapegoat for moral decline. Every group needed it, hated it, or both, which, if you think about it, is basically the story of civilization. By the Renaissance, Europe was dissecting everything from human bodies to philosophy, and cannabis quietly slipped back into medicine cabinets. Apothecaries prescribed it for pain, seizures, and sleeplessness. Poets alluded to it in verse. And while Europe still publicly frowned upon pleasure, it had also just invented gin, so moral judgment was selectively applied. Then came the colonial era, and cannabis set sail again, this time in every direction. The Spanish planted it in the Americas. The Portuguese carried it to Africa. The British industrialized it. Each empire claimed they were introducing a, quote, useful agricultural resource, which is history's polite way of saying, we found a way to profit from this. By the 19th century, cannabis had traveled a remarkable arc, from sacred plant to suspicious vice to scientific curiosity. Victorian society embraced it in tinctures and tonics, using it for nerves, insomnia, and hysteria, while politely ignoring the fact that half of London was quietly addicted to laudanum. Doctors praised it, artists painted about it, and then, inevitably, governments panicked and banned it, because nothing frightens authority quite like people being relaxed. And here we are, thousands of years later, still arguing about the same plant. A plant that outlived pharaohs, philosophers, popes, and prohibition. It built ships, healed wounds, sparked myths, and occasionally made people stare at wallpaper for hours. Humanity keeps trying to control cannabis. And cannabis, ever patient, keeps slipping through our fingers. One puff, one poem, one perfectly rolled piece of history at a time. Rome, 1480. A city so saturated with sin that even the angels were rumored to carry handkerchiefs over their noses. Into this perfumed swirl of power and corruption was born Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, the man who would one day become Pope Alexander VI. From her very first breath, Lucrezia wasn't so much a child as she was a political pawn in human form. Her father, Rodrigo, was not known for moderation. He had mistresses, enemies, children, and possibly a few individuals who fell into more than one of those categories. Her mother, Venosa de Catanei, was one of his longtime lovers, a Roman widow with ambition and the patience required to tolerate a man whose moral compass pointed unwaveringly toward personal gain. Together, they had several children, but Lucrezia was the jewel, intelligent, charming, and, above all, useful. By the time she could walk, her name was already being written into marriage contracts. Imagine being 6 years old and betrothed to unite two noble families you've never met. That was Lucrezia's reality. Her education wasn't about dolls or prayers. It was rhetoric, diplomacy, and the subtle art of looking harmless while quietly plotting someone's downfall. Yet she wasn't a villain. Not yet. Contemporary accounts describe her as graceful, fair-haired, with the kind of beauty Renaissance poets would write odes about before being mysteriously poisoned at dinner. She learned Latin, music, and poetry, the tools of a perfect noblewoman or, more accurately, a flawless bargaining chip. The Borgia name already carried the whiff of scandal, and Lucrezia, though still innocent, would inherit that aroma. As Rodrigo maneuvered his way toward the papal throne through bribes and shadowy deals, Lucrezia watched and learned. She discovered early that in Rome, virtue was decorative. Survival required flexibility, moral, political, and occasionally anatomical. By the time her father became pope, the Vatican had effectively turned into a family business. Cardinals whispered, rivals schemed, and everyone assumed the Borgia's blonde daughter must be in on the corruption. And in some ways, they weren't wrong. Whether she was a serpent in silk or simply a dove raised in a nest of vipers would become one of history's favorite debates. When Rodrigo Borgia officially became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, the Vatican didn't just gain a spiritual leader, it acquired a family enterprise. The Holy See, once, at least theoretically, a fortress of piety and good PR, became an extension of the Borgia household. And like any self-respecting Italian dynasty, business meant three things: marriage, money, and manipulation, areas in which young Lucrezia would soon excel, whether she liked it or not. By age 12, Lucrezia was already being moved across Europe's noble families like an especially elegant chess piece. Her first engagement was to Don Cherubino Juan de Centelles, a Spanish nobleman. That alliance, however, dissolved faster than a papal promise of reform. A second engagement to a Neapolitan noble suffered the same fate once his strategic usefulness expired. Lucrezia's love life was less about romance and more about diplomacy with better jewelry. At 14, her father arranged a marriage to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a man twice her age and half her cunning. It was a purely strategic union, binding the papacy to one of Italy's most powerful families. The wedding, naturally, was a grand Roman spectacle. Nobles dined under frescoed ceilings, toasted with golden goblets, and politely ignored the fact that the Pope's daughter was now effectively a living political treaty. Behind the lace and smiles, Lucrezia played her part flawlessly. She was charming, well-mannered, and spoke like an angel. But angels didn't survive long in Vatican politics. When the Borgias shifted alliances, as they often did, Giovanni found himself on the wrong side of the family strategy. And when the Borgias shifted, someone usually vanished, resigned, or became suddenly ill. Giovanni, unwilling to wait for divine intervention, fled Rome and accused both the Pope and Lucrezia of incest. Yes, he actually accused his teenage wife and father-in-law of an affair. The scandal made Rome both gasp and snicker. At 16, Lucrezia became the talk of Europe, whispered about in every court as both victim and temptress. But the Borgias didn't collapse under gossip. They weaponized it. The Pope swiftly annulled the marriage on grounds of non-consummation, which must have been excruciatingly awkward for everyone involved. Giovanni was publicly humiliated, Lucrezia was legally free, and the game of alliances rolled on. Her break didn't last long. Rodrigo, ever the multitasker, had a new plan wrapped in Neapolitan silk. Lucrezia's next match was Alfonso of Aragon, the handsome, illegitimate son of the King of Naples. This marriage promised political stability for the Papal States and strengthened ties with Naples, a useful move in Italy's endless power shuffle. At 17, Lucrezia seemed genuinely happy for once. Alfonso was close to her age, reportedly kind, and by Renaissance standards, objectively easy on the eyes. A refreshing change after Giovanni Sforza, whose main skill was paranoia. The couple had a son, Rodrigo, named after her father, of course. Because if there's one thing the Borgias understood, it was branding. For a brief moment, the Borgias almost looked respectable, but respectability doesn't sell in Renaissance Rome. Political winds shifted faster than a cardinal's loyalty, and soon the alliance with Naples soured. Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brilliant, ruthless, and occasionally homicidal brother, decided that Alfonso had become inconvenient. And in Borgia speak, inconvenient usually meant doomed. One summer evening in 1500, assassins attacked Alfonso on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Miraculously, he survived the first attempt. But while recuperating in his chambers, someone finished the job. Eyewitnesses claimed Cesare's men strangled him. Others whispered that Lucrezia herself had held the pillow. As with most Borgia stories, the truth likely lies somewhere between horror and gossip. Lucrezia reportedly wept bitterly. Whether for lost love or lost power is anyone's guess. The Vatican issued a predictable story about bandits, and absolutely no one believed it. Rome's rumor mills roared to life. The Pope's daughter. The poisoner. The Black Widow of the Tiber. Whether she was guilty or merely convenient to blame, her reputation was sealed tighter than a confessional door. Yet instead of collapsing under the weight of scandal, Lucrezia adapted. She mastered the delicate art of appearing fragile while quietly outlasting everyone who crossed her. When Rome's rumor mills spun too loudly, she would retreat to convents, officially for reflection, unofficially to let public outrage cool off like a pot left off the fire. By 18, she had already been married twice, widowed once, and accused of more sins than the average cardinal managed in a lifetime. But the game was far from over. Her next marriage wouldn't just secure her family's fading power, it would rewrite her role entirely. In 1502, at the age of 22, Lucrezia Borgia became the Duchess of Ferrara. For the first time, not everyone groaned in horror. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Este family, wasn't about love. It was about survival. The Borgias needed respectability after a decade of blood, scandal, and inconveniently timed deaths. Ferrara, meanwhile, needed papal favor and a sizable dowry. In short, everyone held their noses and smiled for the portraits. When Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara, she brought with her wagon loads of gold, fine fabrics, servants, musicians, and a reputation so notorious it could wilt the city's roses. The Este court, renowned for its elegance, didn't quite know what to do with her. Courtiers whispered that she hid poison in her rings, that her perfume contained arsenic, and that a kiss on her hand might be fatal. One poet famously wrote that her smile contained both heaven and hell. It was Renaissance Italy, after all. Poison and poetry often came in the same package. But Lucrezia didn't come to destroy Ferrara. She came to rebuild herself. Instead of scandal, she offered culture. She transformed the court into a dazzling center of art and intellect, welcoming poets, scholars, and musicians. Even Niccolo Machiavelli, hardly an easy man to impress, praised her political grace. Her marriage to Alfonso wasn't passionate. He preferred cannons to conversation, but it was stable. He respected her intellect and entrusted her with governance while he was away. Lucrezia became Ferrara's unofficial diplomat, mediating between rival powers and writing letters with the kind of tact that could smooth over dynastic feuds. Still, the shadows of Rome lingered. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, died in 1503, reportedly after accidentally drinking poisoned wine intended for someone else, a very on-brand Borgia ending. Cesare Borgia's empire collapsed soon after. Overnight, the family name shifted from untouchable to unmentionable. Lucrezia, ever pragmatic, quietly distanced herself from her notorious lineage. In Ferrara, she wasn't the Pope's daughter, the alleged poisoner, or the Black Widow of the Tiber. She was the Duchess, elegant, composed, and determined to outlive the legends that had once defined her. And, for a time, she succeeded. The serpent of Rome had shed her skin. But peace never lasted long in her world. Her father's death unleashed chaos. With Rodrigo gone, the Vatican turned on the Borgias like wolves scenting blood. Caesar, once the family's iron fist, was stripped of his lands, armies, and leverage. Captured, imprisoned, and eventually killed in Spain at 31, he died as a tragic echo of the man who once made princes tremble. The fall of the Borgias left Lucrezia surrounded by enemies. In Rome, her name remained synonymous with sin. In Ferrara, it was still a polite scandal. Whispers about poison, incest, and treachery circulated like bedtime stories for jaded nobles. But she didn't flinch. In her letters to allies, she adopted a tone of melancholy grace, calling herself a woman of misfortune. It was a strategic phrasing. She didn't deny her past. She simply outlived it. While her relatives were stripped of titles and driven from cities, she remained securely in Ferrara, navigating the fractured political landscape like a shipwreck survivor who'd washed ashore on an island of gold. Her husband, Alfonso, who had once viewed her with suspicion, came to rely on her. She handled correspondence, managed estates, and entertained ambassadors with the polish of a seasoned stateswoman. The Duchess of Ferrara might have been born in scandal, but she had perfected the art of endurance. Lucrezia Borgia, once the Vatican's most infamous daughter, had quietly transformed herself into one of Renaissance Italy's most formidable women. Still, an invisible shadow lingered in her chambers, the quiet understanding that the Borgia name would never be fully cleansed. Rome no longer gossiped about the family, but Lucrezia knew silence in Italy was rarely innocent. It was the silence of people waiting for the next rumor to prove them right. By the early 1510s, Lucrezia Borgia had achieved what few in Renaissance Italy thought possible. She had transformed from the Vatican's scandalous daughter into one of its most admired duchesses. Her court in Ferrara became a haven for poets, painters, and philosophers. a kind of cultural rehabilitation center where tortured geniuses could complain about the Pope over excellent wine. Under her patronage, Ferrara blossomed into a jewel of the Italian Renaissance. She supported writers like Ludovico Ariosto, whose Orlando Furioso would become a literary masterpiece. Composers such as Josquin des Prez and Antonio de Vitis filled her palace with both sacred hymns and suspiciously secular ballads. Lucrezia herself played the lute, wrote poetry, and hosted salons, so sophisticated they made Florence's Medici circles look just a little provincial. But what truly set Lucrezia apart wasn't simply her refined taste. It was her quiet power. While Alfonso spent hours discussing fortifications and cannon calibers, as one does when one is a Renaissance duke, she managed diplomacy with elegance and precision. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and Venice wrote home in tones of respectful surprise, describing her as intelligent, gracious, and in a phrase that must have delighted her, nothing like her family. And yet, whispers followed her everywhere. Visitors would admire the frescoes, sip her fine wine, and eventually, in hushed tones, ask if she still kept a vial of poison tucked among her perfumes. The Renaissance loved nothing more than a redemption story wrapped in suspicion. Behind the polished surface, her private life was less glittering. She bore multiple children, endured miscarriages, and lived with the pragmatic distance of a husband who was more soldier than lover. Still, she refused to let tragedy define her. In her letters, she spoke of faith, music, and inner peace. Not as confessions, but as acts of survival. Her relationship with the church remained complex. She funded monasteries and charities, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps because, in Renaissance Italy, salvation was just another strategic investment. She befriended reform-minded clerics, but always with careful distance. After all, when your family once ran the papacy like a Renaissance crime syndicate, you don't get to give sermons on holiness. In Ferrara, Lucrezia built what Rome had denied her, legitimacy. But the Renaissance had impeccable timing when it came to tragedy, and even duchesses who escaped their pasts couldn't escape mortality. By 1512, her carefully reconstructed life began to crack under the weight of grief. Her elegant court, once alive with music and debate, grew somber. Her beloved son Rodrigo, the child she'd had with Alfonso of Aragon years earlier, died unexpectedly at the age of 12 in Naples, far from her reach. The news hit her like a dagger dipped in memory. Letters from the time describe her anguish vividly. "I am left with no comfort," she wrote to a confidant, "except the prayers I whisper at dawn." The tone wasn't political. It was heartbreak laid bare. For a woman accused of every sin under the sun, she appeared suddenly, achingly human. Fate wasn't done twisting the knife. 2 more of her children died in infancy. Her health, strained by years of childbirth, courtly pressures, and Renaissance medicine, which was more optimistic than effective, began to fail. Some whispered poison, because, of course, they did. But the reality was simpler. Her body was exhausted. Even as tragedy closed in, her dignity deepened. She turned increasingly toward religion, not with the fire and brimstone theatrics of her papal father, but with quiet, personal devotion. She corresponded with monks, gave generously to convents, and spent long hours in prayer, not to cleanse her name, but perhaps to finally find some peace beyond it. The court chroniclers, those very same men who once dubbed her the Viper of Rome, began to speak of Lucrezia with unexpected reverence. They called her the Christian Duchess. Even Alfonso, a man who preferred the company of cannons to human emotion, came to admire her resilience. He relied on her counsel once more, though she was often ill and withdrawn. The irony was delicious. The woman who had once been accused of scheming with poison and lust now embodied piety and composure. To outsiders, it looked like redemption. To Lucrezia, perhaps, it felt more like exhaustion. The endless political games, the deaths, the whispers. They had burned through her spirit, and yet she wasn't finished. Her final years would show that, even in fragility, she could still hold the stage. By 1518, Lucrezia Borgia was no longer the glittering duchess who had enchanted Ferrara's salons. She had become something quieter, softer, but still magnetic. Rome's gossip mongers had moved on to newer scandals, and in that silence, she found a rare and fragile peace. Her days revolved around her children, her faith, and the gentle rhythms of court life that no longer demanded she prove herself. Her eldest surviving son, Ercole, was being groomed to become the next Duke of Ferrara. She adored him, writing letters filled with tender advice and an almost fatalistic awareness that her time was growing short. Her marriage to Alfonso had settled into something sturdier than romance, a partnership built on mutual respect or perhaps shared endurance. But shadows remained. Lucrezia's health, long weakened by years of pregnancies, political stress, and Renaissance medical care, deteriorated further. Chronic fevers and fainting spells often confined her to bed, and yet she faced her decline with characteristic grace. Visitors described her as serene, almost luminous, even as her strength faded. In June 1519, she went into labor for the 10th time. The baby, a girl, was stillborn. Complications set in, followed by infection. Renaissance medicine, essentially a mix of herbs, prayers, and good intentions, could do little. As the fever worsened, Lucrezia requested confession, received the sacraments, and asked to be left alone with her chaplain. Those who saw her in her final days spoke of her calm acceptance, a quiet dignity far removed from the Vatican seductress portrayed in the pamphlets. On June 24, 1519, Lucrezia Borgia died at the age of 39. Her last words were reportedly a prayer for her children, and, quote, "for the peace of those who wronged me." Ferrara mourned her deeply. Poets wept. Courtiers spoke of her kindness. Even those who had doubted her grace admitted she had died as a true Christian lady. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini, a peaceful sanctuary far removed from the poisonous splendor of Rome. In death, she achieved what she had been denied in life: silence. Not the brittle silence of rumor, but the deep, final quiet of being left alone. Of course, death didn't end Lucrezia Borgia's story. It immortalized it. Within months, pamphlets, poems, and chronicles across Europe began reshaping her life into legend. To some, she became the perfect Renaissance monster, the Pope's daughter who dealt in poison, lust, and intrigue. To others, she was the innocent pawn, ensnared in a web spun by men far more ruthless than she. The truth, as always with the Borgias, was both and neither. Later writers adored her contradictions. Victor Hugo cast her as a deadly femme fatale in his 1833 play, Lucrece Borgia. Donizetti turned that same myth into an opera, giving her voice soaring arias of guilt and vengeance. Painters depicted her with golden hair and cold eyes, one hand holding a goblet, the other resting on a skull, half Madonna, half executioner. Even Machiavelli, who had known her brother Cesare, hinted that her political grace made her as formidable as any prince. And yet, those who read her surviving letters found a different woman, a mother who wrote tenderly to her children, a duchess concerned with convent finances, a believer who prayed daily. She signed her letters, "Your most devoted Lucrezia." There was no venom there, no seduction, only intelligence and melancholy. Her legend endured because she embodied the contradictions of the Renaissance itself: beauty and corruption, grace and ambition, sanctity and sin. She lived in an age when men poisoned cities and called it diplomacy, but because she was a woman, her every smile became a scandal. The same world that forgave popes for murder never forgave Lucrezia Borgia for surviving it. Centuries later, historians began to reclaim her humanity. Modern scholarship sees not a she-devil, but a political survivor, born into an impossible family. She played the role history dealt her, and she played it so well that her name still captures imaginations 500 years later, not as a footnote to her father's sins, but as a complex woman who navigated a world determined to misunderstand her. In the end, Lucrezia Borgia became exactly what history adores most, a riddle with perfect handwriting. Whether she was saint or serpent depends entirely on who holds the pen. But one thing is certain. Few women ever danced so gracefully along the knife's edge between damnation and immortality. And even after death, the world kept whispering her name. Now, let's gently close the door on Renaissance intrigue and step further back in time, to the heart of ancient Rome. Between the Aventine and Palatine hills stood a monument to chaos, glory, and the occasional trampled charioteer, the Circus Maximus. This wasn't just an arena. It was Rome's beating heart, dusty, dangerous, and utterly alive. On race days, half the city poured in. Over 200,000 people packed shoulder to shoulder, shouting, sweating, and praying that their favorite team wouldn't wipe out before the first turn. From afar, the circus looked like a sun-bleached colossus, stretching nearly 600 meters. Up close, it was pure frenzy. Senators lounged under silk awnings, their rings flashing in the light. Commoners crowded the stone terraces, waving scraps of colored cloth, red, blue, green, or white, the banners of their beloved racing factions. Even the emperor himself would lean forward when the signal dropped, as eager as the butcher or baker seated below. Trumpets blared. The young charioteers, brave, or perhaps just lacking a sense of self-preservation, tightened their reins and whispered quick prayers to Fortuna, goddess of luck. Horses snorted, bronze fittings gleamed, and with a sudden drop of the white starting cloth, the race exploded into motion. 12 teams thundered forward. Wheels rattled, sand erupted beneath hooves, and the roar of the crowd made the marble tremble. The air filled with the smells of sweat, leather, and burnt oil, not unlike the pit lane of a Formula One race, just with more divine intervention and fewer safety rails. One wrong turn at the spina, the central divider, and a driver could be catapulted into the stands or crushed under his own team. Glory and disaster were only ever a heartbeat apart. A victorious charioteer could become a celebrity overnight. His name sung in taverns, painted on walls, whispered like a lucky charm. For Romans, the circus wasn't just entertainment. It was ritual. Each race was a prayer in motion. Each crash, a reminder that the gods were listening, and sometimes laughing. It was where emperors courted popularity, gamblers courted fortune, and the poorest slave could feel, if only for a moment, the intoxicating rush of control. If the Circus Maximus was Rome's heart, its rhythm was divided into 4 colors: red, blue, green, and white. These weren't just teams, they were identities. Political loyalties. Emotional addictions wrapped in horsehair and leather. The reds were fiery, beloved by the working classes. The whites were the team of tradition, old money, and dignified nodding. The greens, backed by ambitious merchants, had a reputation for cunning and for occasionally adjusting race results through creative bribes. And the blues, well, they were the darlings of the elite. Senators, emperors, and people who always got the best seats supported them. These factions weren't fan clubs, they were institutions. They ran stables, hired trainers, imported the best horses from Spain and North Africa, and maintained intelligence networks so extensive they could rival the Roman army. Some even kept slaves whose only job was to cheer louder than the rival fans. Imagine professional hype squads, but armed with lung power and civic pride. And the fans, oh, the fans. Riots erupted in the streets over lost races and alleged sabotage. Think modern soccer hooliganism, but with swords and torches. Emperor Nero once tried to calm the chaos by supporting both the greens and the blues. Naturally, this backfired spectacularly. Everyone wanted imperial favoritism, and no one wanted to share. For the Romans, a race wasn't just a race, it was personal. If your faction won, you walked home taller. If they lost, you drowned your sorrows in cheap wine and vowed revenge at the next race. In the Circus Maximus, identity wasn't worn. It was shouted, with dust in your throat and a bet in your hand. And as the dust settled after each thunderous race, one truth remained clear. Rome lived for the spectacle, and sometimes it died for it too. Children were baptized in team colors. Marriages cracked under the weight of rival allegiances. More than one duel began over whether a green driver had accidentally clipped a blues wheel. Imagine divorcing someone today because they rooted for the wrong football club, and then challenging their cousin to a sword fight in the street to defend your team's honor. That was Rome. The Circus Maximus wasn't just a racetrack, it was the empire's social battlefield. And when the colors clashed, it wasn't the horses that collided. It was Rome's soul. To the roaring crowds, charioteers were gods on wheels, adored, envied, and usually dead before 30. Their names echoed through taverns and markets like pop stars of the ancient world. Scorpus, Diocles, Porphyrius men, who could transform a lap around the spina into a moment of eternal glory. But behind the glamour was grit. Most of these young men weren't born noble, they were slaves, bought by racing factions as boys, trained in the art of speed and survival. The lucky ones earned their freedom through victories. The luckier ones lived long enough to enjoy it. Training started in the stables, where boys learned to control 4 horses at once, 2 tons of muscle, nerves, and divine stubbornness. Reins were wrapped around their waists for extra control, which meant if they fell, the horses would kindly drag them until physics intervened. Their chariots were lightweight death traps of wood and leather, built for speed, not safety. Drivers leaned forward, knees bent, eyes sharp, trying to balance between pushing for victory and avoiding becoming part of the track. Lean too far, and you flipped. React too slow, and you were trampled. But the rewards were irresistible. A successful charioteer could earn tens of thousands of sesterces each season, fortunes that rivaled senators. Gaius Appuleius Diocles, the most famous driver of all, retired after 24 years with a fortune equivalent to hundreds of millions today. He could have bought a city or several very fancy bathhouses. Even he admitted, though, that every triumph came with a price. Broken bones, dead horses, lost friends. Fans adored their heroes obsessively. They painted portraits of them on walls, wore charms shaped like their faces, and muttered little prayers before each race. Some even left offerings at shrines, locks of hair, coins, or, in classic Roman fashion, curses against rival teams. Charioteers knew the truth. They weren't just athletes. They were gladiators on wheels. Every race was a calculated flirtation with death, and in a city that worshipped spectacle, dying dramatically was almost as good as winning. When the signal dropped and the mappa, a white cloth, fell from the magistrate's hand, time seemed to hold its breath. The gates flew open. 12 chariots lunged forward like unleashed beasts. The roar of the crowd hit like thunder rolling through marble. For the next 7 laps, about 5 miles, the Circus Maximus transformed into a storm of speed, sand, and sheer willpower. The track circled the spina, the central divider adorned with statues, shrines, and the famous obelisks borrowed from Egypt. It was divine theater, men battling for glory beneath the gaze of gods. But down on the sand, nobody was thinking about Apollo. They were thinking about survival. Charioteers wrapped their reins around their bodies for control, the whip flicking with terrifying precision. Their 4-horse teams, or quadrigae, had to move like a single organism. The outside horse set the speed. The inside dictated the angle. If one faltered, the entire rig could splinter like cheap pottery. The most dangerous points were the metae, the turning posts at each end. Skilled drivers scraped past so close their wheels kissed the stone. A careless one clipped it and went flying. Crashes, called naufragia or shipwrecks, were the crowd's guilty pleasure. Wood shattered, horses screamed, bodies tumbled, and the stands roared with bloodthirsty delight. Women fainted, gamblers tore their tunics, emperors leaned forward with morbid fascination. And the race didn't stop for anyone. Fallen charioteers became obstacles, their wrecks part of the deadly calculus of victory. Bronze dolphins or eggs mounted along the spina marked the laps. Each one turned as the race progressed, driving the crowd into a frenzy. 6 dolphins down, 1 to go, and the Circus Maximus shook with anticipation. When the victor finally crossed the finish line, covered in dust and trembling from adrenaline, the noise was said to shake the heavens. This wasn't just sport. It was Rome itself, reckless, magnificent, and utterly addicted to the roar of victory. Beneath all that thunder, another battle unfolded, one fought with coins, curses, and obsession. Betting at the Circus Maximus wasn't a pastime. It was Rome's unofficial religion. Senators, soldiers, and slaves alike wagered fortunes on the outcome. The only universal truth? Fortuna favored no one for long. Bookmakers prowled the stands like caffeinated accountants, wax tablets in hand, ready to record wagers on absolutely everything. Who would win? How many crashes? Whether that one temperamental horse would even make it past the first turn without a divine intervention. Coins changed hands like offerings at a temple, and whispers rose to Fortuna, goddess of chance, who for many Romans was far more dependable than Jupiter on a good day. The stakes were dizzying. Wealthy patricians wagered entire estates on a single race, while poor laborers gambled away their week's wages hoping to turn sweat into silver. Some actually did strike it rich. Others ended the day with lighter purses and fewer clothes, having sold their cloaks to cover their debts. Every so often, a gambler would take a dramatic leap from the stands after a crushing loss, a gesture the Romans found tragic, but also in their own grim way a little bit theatrical. And the betting wasn't limited to outcomes. Factions bribed stable hands for inside information. Was a horse secretly sick? Did a driver nurse a hidden injury? Had someone accidentally shaved a wheel a little too thin? Rumors traveled through the circus like wildfire, and odds shifted with every whisper. Rome, always the empire of spectacle, turned even deception into part of the entertainment. But wagering wasn't just about money. It was tribal warfare disguised as sport. When races went badly, faction supporters spilled into the streets, blaming corruption, divine injustice, or just spectacularly bad luck. One infamous riot between the Greens and the Blues escalated so badly that parts of the city were set on fire. Imagine soccer hooliganism, but with more marble, fewer laws, and a lot more torches. Even emperors weren't immune. Caligula bet enormous sums on his beloved greens, and once threatened to execute a driver for losing him a race, which is one way to motivate performance reviews. Nero, naturally, took it further. He entered as a driver himself and declared victory even after falling out of the chariot. When you're emperor, the rules are more like suggestions. Money flowed through the Circus Maximus like blood, and just as freely, people didn't merely watch the races. They lived them, bled for them, and sometimes died because of them. For Rome, gambling wasn't a hobby. It was destiny, just with worse odds. Before marble statues and imperial cults stole the spotlight, the true celebrities of Rome weren't emperors. They were charioteers. Lean, sunburned, and usually one crash away from disaster, these men enjoyed fame greater than generals. Their portraits hung in taverns. Their names were carved into walls. Their fans screamed louder than legions returning from conquest. Gaius Apuleius Diocles became the Michael Jordan of the Circus Maximus. Racing for 24 years, he switched factions like modern athletes chasing better contracts. He won nearly 500 races and amassed a fortune so vast he could have funded Rome for a year, or at least thrown a dinner party so extravagant that future historians would still talk about it. Then there was Scorpus, the golden boy of the greens. Young, fast, impossibly charismatic. He 2001 races before dying in a crash at just 26. His tombstone still reads, "I carried off the victory palm 1,000 times, but I was cheated of my youth." The crowd mourned as though Jupiter himself had tumbled from the heavens. What made these men extraordinary wasn't noble birth. Most had none. Slaves, freedmen, foreigners, the poor. Through sheer skill and reckless courage, they became idols. It was, strangely, the most democratic form of worship Rome ever practiced. And with fame came indulgence. Top drivers lived like kings. Villas, servants, lovers, and more wine than a Bacchic festival. Racing factions guarded them like prized war horses, surrounding them with bodyguards, bribes, and occasionally a discreet poisoning to keep rivals at bay. There were fan clubs, groupies, and even gang-like groups of supporters ready to riot if their hero switched teams. Imagine Julius Caesar suddenly joining the enemy mid-battle. They were adored and despised in equal measure, praised for their skill, cursed for their arrogance, immortalized in mosaics and bathroom graffiti alike. For Rome's masses, these men embodied everything thrilling and dangerous about their world: glory, peril, and the intoxicating promise that anyone, no matter how humble their birth, could brush against immortality. To an outsider, the Circus Maximus might have looked like just a racetrack. But to those who lived in Rome, it was the empire's most powerful political arena, a place where passions boiled, fortunes shifted, and destiny wore 4 colors. The roar of the Circus Maximus wasn't just for the horses. It was for loyalty, ideology, and power, all neatly packaged in a few laps around a dusty track. Emperors understood this better than anyone. A happy mob was a quiet mob, and the fastest way to keep a city of 1 million people quiet was with panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Politicians sponsored races to buy affection. The bigger the games, the more generous the host appeared. New emperors often launched their reigns with extravagant spectacles, flinging coins into the crowd like holy water, hoping cheers would drown out doubts. The crowd didn't just roar for speed, they roared with gratitude, fleeting, fickle, but often enough to keep daggers out of imperial backs. The racing factions themselves were like miniature political parties. Each had its patrons in the Senate and the palace. The Blues, with their aristocratic supporters, represented the conservative elite, the kind of people who toasted Jupiter before raising your taxes. The Greens drew their strength from merchants and the working poor, louder, scrappier, and not shy about starting trouble. Their rivalry occasionally turned deadly, spilling out of the circus into the streets, tearing through neighborhoods, temples, and anyone unlucky enough to be wearing the wrong color that day. Even emperors picked sides. Domitian favored the Greens. Caligula loved the Blues so much he once dined in their stables, as one does when subtlety isn't your strong suit. Nero, ever the showman, declared himself charioteer of all factions, though curiously he always won. The crowd knew the races were rigged, but pretending otherwise was part of the fun. The circus was Rome's pressure valve. When taxes rose or grain shipments failed, the mob didn't storm the Senate. They booed the emperor during the races, and those boos mattered. A poorly received spectacle could spark uprisings. Centuries later, Emperor Justinian would learn this lesson the hard way, when faction riots at the Hippodrome nearly burned Constantinople to the ground. Rome had written the manual. Everyone else just borrowed it. To emperors, the Circus Maximus was both blessing and curse, the one place where public joy could keep them in power or end their reign by sundown. Every lap was more than sport. It was Rome in miniature, fast, brilliant, and always one sharp turn away from disaster. The Circus Maximus embodied Rome at its most dazzling and its most brutal. Beneath the music and cheers lay a ritual of destruction. Crashes, called naufragia or shipwrecks, were the soul of the show. They happened often enough that many Romans began to see them as divine signs. When a chariot smashed against the spina, some swore they could see the gods choosing their favorites in real time. Horses screamed. Wheels splintered. Drivers were flung like rag dolls into the dust. The lucky ones were trampled instantly. The unlucky were dragged around the track by their own reins until only their horses crossed the finish line. And yet, the crowd cheered louder for the wrecks than for the wins. Mercy wasn't part of the circus. It was a mirror of Roman values. Courage, spectacle, discipline. Survival was optional. When a driver crashed, the audience rose as one, shouting his name, not to mourn but to honor him. He wasn't a victim. He was a hero who gave everything to the race. The dead didn't simply vanish. They became legends in dust and blood. Repair crews rushed in between races, dragging away splintered chariots, mangled wheels, and whatever remained of unfortunate drivers. Musicians played loudly to cover the sounds. Minutes later, the next race began, as if nothing had happened. For all its violence, the circus wasn't chaos. It was orchestrated madness. Engineers kept precise lap timings. Priests blessed the spina before each event. The emperor watched from his gilded box, ensuring both gods and mob were satisfied. It was this balance, danger wrapped in ceremony, that made the Circus Maximus immortal. The people didn't just want entertainment. They wanted transcendence, that fleeting sense of being part of something larger, louder, and bloodier than themselves. And when the dust finally settled, the scent of sweat, wine, and crushed flowers hung over the stands, the perfume of Rome's favorite addiction. Whether in victory or wreckage, the circus always gave the people what they craved most, a reason to feel alive. For nearly 1,000 years, the Circus Maximus echoed with thunder, hooves, cheers, and the heartbeat of an empire. But, like all empires, its glory dimmed. The end didn't come with a crash. It came quietly, like embers cooling in the sand they once ignited. By the 4th century, the old gods had lost their audience. Christianity swept through the empire, and with it came a new moral outlook, one that frowned on pagan bloodlust and drunken afternoons at the races. The roar began to fade. Bishops called the races sinful distractions, shaking their heads at the pagan joy that still echoed through the arena. But the people resisted. By then, the circus had become something deeper than religion or ritual. It was tradition, identity, memory. For generations who had nothing left to worship, the roar of the crowd was the last sound of Rome that still felt divine. But empires, like horses, grow tired. The coffers thinned. And so did patience. Keeping the Circus Maximus alive was expensive. Horses, chariots, drivers, lavish prizes. All of it required a level of imperial wealth that simply wasn't there anymore. The factions, once rich with sponsorship, began to crumble. Without steady funding, stables emptied, chariots rotted, and the proud banners of red, blue, green, and white sagged into silence. The Gothic wars and foreign invasions finished what neglect had begun. The Circus Maximus, once the pride of the capital, became first a battleground, then a dumping ground. Weeds crept across the track where Scorpus once raced. Statues toppled. Obelisks were hauled off to decorate papal Rome, as if Christianity were trying to domesticate the ghost of its pagan past. By the time the Western Empire finally collapsed, the great stadium was a ruin, but in memory, it never stopped roaring. For centuries afterward, Romans told stories of the circus as if it were yesterday. They imagined the sun flashing off the reins, the crowd rising in a single wave, the victorious cry slicing through the air like a blade of joy. Even in ruin, the shape of the track remained, a scar across the city that refused to fade. Today, tourists stroll across a flattened field where 500,000 people once screamed themselves hoarse. The silence there isn't empty. It's almost sacred. If you close your eyes, you can still sense the ghosts, the thunder of hooves, the shimmer of dust, the impossible speed. Rome may have fallen, but the Circus Maximus, that mad, glorious heartbeat of a civilization, never truly stopped running. And as the echoes of ancient wheels fade into the background, we step forward a millennium. This stage shifts to 12th century France, a land draped in velvet, humming with poetry, and absolutely bursting with well-dressed trouble. From a distance, medieval France shimmered with chivalry, piety, and courtly grace. But behind the curtains? Whispers, poison, and love affairs sharp enough to redraw family trees. King Louis VI, pious to the point of exhaustion, dreamed of a kingdom ruled by virtue. His courtiers dreamed of, well, each other's fortunes, titles, and occasionally spouses. Paris and Poitiers buzzed with equal parts poetry and scandal. Troubadours sang of courtly love, that beautifully polished form of adultery that somehow made cheating sound noble. A knight could swear eternal devotion to a married lady, and if her husband objected, well, clearly he just didn't understand romance. At the center of this glittering hypocrisy stood Eleanor of Aquitaine, bold, intelligent, and far too alive for her husband's austere religiosity. She brought a southern sensuality that scandalized northern clergy and electrified the court. Her circle became a paradise for poets, lovers, and opportunists. There, love was a sport, gossip was currency, and fidelity was more of a creative suggestion than a rule. Behind every gallant bow and courtly smile lurked calculations, a favor traded, a rumor planted, a letter slipped through a servant's hands at midnight. Marriages were political contracts, not romances, and one misplaced glance could unravel an entire lineage. The court's moral theater stretched from Paris to the great duchies of Champagne and Aquitaine. In those candle-lit halls where minstrels sang of unattainable love, real men and women risked everything to make those verses true. Affairs weren't just passion. They were rebellion against arranged marriages and rigid hierarchies. But the 12th century court was a dangerous stage. Behind the lace and Latin poetry were spies, confessing priests, sharp-eared servants, and nobles who wielded gossip like a blade. In this kingdom wrapped in silk, every kiss was political, and every act of love could light the fuse of a war. If France had a heartbeat in the 12th century, it pulsed through Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born into one of Europe's wealthiest duchies, Eleanor of Aquitaine was everything the medieval world pretended women weren't supposed to be: brilliant, seductive, and dangerously independent. Her marriage to Louis VII of France was supposed to unite piety and power. Instead, it produced one of the most combustible pairings in royal history. Louis was devout, cautious, and almost painfully humble, the kind of man who might apologize to God for enjoying his soup too much. Eleanor, by contrast, was raised in Aquitaine, a land of troubadours, music, and open flirtation. She found Louis's court suffocating, his priests exhausting, and his endless confessions, let's just say, not ideal for someone with political ambitions. Her charisma turned heads wherever she went. Poets adored her. Knights hovered near her like moths around a torch. Even crusaders weren't immune. During the Second Crusade, Eleanor traveled with Louis to the Holy Land, and Europe buzzed with gossip. Chronicles whispered about her spending more time with her dashing uncle Raymond of Poitiers than with her husband. True or not, it was exactly the sort of story that could torch a reputation faster than a dropped lantern in a tapestry hall. When they returned to France, the marriage was essentially a ceremonial corpse. Louis, humiliated and convinced the whole affair was divine punishment, sought an annulment. Eleanor, meanwhile, didn't grieve. She schemed. Within weeks, she secured a marriage to Henry of Anjou, soon to become Henry II of England. It was one of the boldest political moves of the age. The woman who had been Queen of France was now Queen of England, and she brought half of southwestern France with her. Paris was scandalized. Bishops wagged fingers at her immodest haste. Nobles whispered about witchcraft because, clearly, no woman could change kings so quickly without help from the devil. But Eleanor didn't need sorcery. She had timing, intelligence, and a sharp sense of her own worth. What had begun as personal humiliation became geopolitical triumph. The French court lost its brightest flame, but in England, Eleanor's influence was just beginning. Her second marriage united England, Normandy, and Aquitaine, and paired two of the most explosive personalities of the Middle Ages. Henry was brilliant, restless, and notoriously temperamental. Eleanor was equally intelligent and twice as proud. Together, they were magnificent and utterly disastrous. At first, their union burned bright. Henry admired her wit. She enjoyed finally having a husband who wasn't terrified of her. Their court became a stage for intellect and ambition. Diplomats marveled. Poets sang. Enemies worried. But in a palace where words were weapons, affection easily curdled into rivalry. Henry's appetite for control was legendary. He managed his lands, clergy, barons, and, disastrously, his wife, as if they were all just provinces of his empire. Eleanor, long used to ruling in her own right as Duchess of Aquitaine, bristled at being reduced to a royal ornament. She retreated to Poitiers, surrounding herself with poets and philosophers. But beneath the songs and dances, rebellion simmered. Rumors filled the halls. Henry took mistresses freely, and when his relationship with Rosamund Clifford became public, Eleanor's humiliation became the stuff of legend. Chroniclers embroidered the tale with stories of labyrinths, daggers, and jealous queens. Probably fiction, but emotionally spot on. By her 50s, Eleanor stood at the center of a royal family civil war. Her sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, turned against their father with their mother's quiet blessing. In a world ruled by kings, Eleanor's pen became her sword. What began as a domestic rift soon grew into a political earthquake that shook both England and France. By 1173, the great Angevin Empire wasn't so much a dynasty as it was a powder keg with titles. Henry's sons were handsome, ambitious, and painfully aware that their father had no intention of sharing real power. He wore the crown, they merely borrowed its shine. The eldest, Henry the young king, was crowned during his father's lifetime, but treated more like a living heirloom than a co-ruler. Richard, the future Lionheart, seethed in Aquitaine under his mother's tutelage. Geoffrey of Brittany schemed with the cunning of a man twice his age. And Eleanor, exiled from court and nursing old humiliations, saw in her sons a chance to strike back. Vengeance wrapped neatly in the language of honor and justice. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic family feuds in medieval history, not with dragons or thrones, but with crowns, betrayals, and letters written in code. The rebellion began quietly, the way most great family dramas do, with letters, secret promises, and the kind of polite treachery that only medieval nobles could pull off with straight faces. Eleanor encouraged her sons to rise against their father, wrapping her motives in noble language. She spoke of autonomy, legacy, and justice. Though, of course, a little revenge never hurt. And then, as if history wanted to add a twist, her former husband, King Louis VII of France, joined in. Apparently, grudges in medieval Europe had a shelf life longer than monastery wine. With France arming her sons, Henry II's vast empire began to crack like old stone under rain. Henry responded with fury and precision. His armies swept through Aquitaine. Castle after castle fell, loyalty folding under the weight of siege engines. The rebellion, fierce but short-lived, collapsed. The sons were forgiven. Sons always were, eventually. But Eleanor was not. She was captured trying to flee to her lands, and just like that, the most brilliant queen in Europe became her husband's prisoner. For 16 years, Henry kept her under guard, moving her between castles like some dangerous artifact he didn't dare destroy. Courtiers whispered that she spent her days composing poetry and her nights plotting revenge, which, to be fair, sounds like exactly what Eleanor of Aquitaine would do. Outside, time marched on. Her daughters married into Europe's great courts. Her sons kept rebelling, kept dying. Her name, carried in songs and rumors, never faded. Henry's victory, meanwhile, began to sour. His sons distrusted him, his allies hesitated, and his wife, brilliant, legendary, and now unjustly caged, became the living embodiment of his tyranny. For 16 years, Eleanor's world was made of stone walls and whispered letters. But legends don't stay locked up forever. Henry's own life unraveled like a badly stitched tapestry. His favored son, Henry the young king, died during yet another rebellion, whispering for forgiveness on his deathbed. Geoffrey of Brittany was trampled at a tournament. Only Richard and John remained, one noble, one venomous, both destined to betray him. Henry's great love, Rosamund Clifford, died amid court gossip thick, with Eleanor's supposed invisible hand. People whispered about poison and secret labyrinths, because even in captivity, Eleanor's reputation moved faster than riders on the King's Road. By 1189, Henry was sick, exhausted, and surrounded by betrayal. His sons rebelled once again, this time led by Richard, with Eleanor's quiet blessing. And, because history enjoys symmetry, the French king who supported them was Philip II, the son of her first husband, Louis VII. The past had come back for its due. Defeated and ill, Henry surrendered. When he saw his youngest son John's name on the list of rebels, he turned his face to the wall and murmured, "Now let everything end." And it did. Henry died that same year, undone not by armies, but by his own family. When news of his death reached Eleanor, her chains finally fell away. Not with trumpets or fanfare, but with the steady inevitability of a tide coming in. At nearly 70, the woman who had once dazzled courts and defied kings stepped into daylight again. Her son Richard, newly crowned and eager to begin his reign, didn't waste time with victory parades. His first act as king was simple: free Eleanor of Aquitaine. The prisoner became the queen again, not just in title, but in presence. And history, as it so often did with her, leaned in a little closer to watch what she would do next. After 16 years behind stone walls, Eleanor of Aquitaine emerged not like a broken prisoner, but like someone who'd simply been waiting for the world to catch up. Courtiers stared. She was nearly 70, but the years hadn't diminished her. If anything, they'd polished her into something formidable. She wore her age like armor, and her gaze still carried the weight of a throne room. Richard the Lionheart, ever the soldier, understood immediately. His mother's mind was sharper than any sword he owned. He made her his partner in rule. Not officially, of course, medieval Europe wasn't ready for that, but in practice, while he chased crusades and glory, She ran the empire. She managed treasuries, negotiated truces, and smoothed over the sharp edges of her son's ambition. Where Richard stormed, Eleanor steadied. Court gossip swirled, as it always did. Richard's rumored passions, whispered to include both men and women, gave poets and bishops something to chatter about. Eleanor ignored it. She'd seen far worse than rumors. Her focus was survival. Not her own, but the empire's. And when Richard was captured on his way home from the crusade, she proved why her legend had endured. Nearly 80 years old, Eleanor rode across the Alps, negotiated with emperors, and raised an eye-watering ransom, 150,000 marks, enough to nearly bankrupt England. Chroniclers compared her to a lioness retrieving her cub. When Richard returned, he was celebrated as a hero, but everyone with eyes knew the truth. England still stood because his mother had held it together while he was gone. Peace, however, was not something Eleanor's family excelled at. Richard's relentless campaigns drained the treasury, and in his absence, his brother John eagerly filled the power vacuum. John, clever, petty, suspicious John, had already betrayed their father and schemed during Richard's imprisonment. Eleanor saw through him. Where Richard inspired loyalty, John inspired fear, and fear was a shaky foundation for a kingdom. In her final years, Eleanor became the quiet architect, holding together a crumbling empire. She brokered truces, soothed restless nobles, and sent letters that carried more weight than royal decrees. But time, even for queens, is a patient conqueror. When Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt in 1199, she rushed to his side. He told her not to weep. "You gave birth to kings, and kings do not die with tears." His death fractured what little unity remained. John seized the throne before Richard's body was cold. At 77, Eleanor might have retreated to a convent, as queens often did. Instead, she mounted her horse yet again, riding through Aquitaine to secure support for her least promising son. Even those who disliked John followed her lead. She was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her name still bent power like iron. But John's reign was what everyone secretly expected. Intrigue, paranoia, betrayal. He quarreled with barons, alienated the church, and dismantled what his family had built. Eleanor, wise enough to recognize the shape of decline, gradually withdrew from court. She'd raised both lions and jackals, and she knew which one was now at the throne. Her last great political act was deeply symbolic. She arranged the marriage of her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, to the French heir, a deliberate attempt to weave peace between two kingdoms soaked in centuries of rivalry. It wasn't conquest or rebellion this time. It was diplomacy, a fragile, fleeting peace, but peace nonetheless. By the dawn of the 13th century, Eleanor of Aquitaine had outlived almost everyone who had tried to control her. Two kings, countless nobles, rivals, lovers, all gone. She remained at Fontevraud Abbey, not as a relic, but as a living legend. From her desk, not a throne, she ruled through letters. Her correspondence could move armies, mend alliances, or quietly reshape Europe. Age had not dulled her. If anything, it had made her voice quieter, and therefore harder to ignore. Kings and bishops still sought her counsel. Nobles still invoked her name. And across the courts of Europe, the mere mention of Eleanor of Aquitaine could silence a room. Exactly. That closing passage ties her story together beautifully. Soft, reflective, and just a touch ironic, like the quiet ending of a long, tangled play. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just live through history. She rewrote it with a raised eyebrow and a perfectly timed letter. Chroniclers could never quite decide if she was a sinner or a saint, so they split the difference and made her a legend. Poets adored her, priests distrusted her, kings underestimated her, and generations inherited her chaos like a family heirloom. She didn't conquer through swords, but through subtler weapons: intelligence, charm, timing. In a world where queens were meant to sit quietly beside thrones, she climbed onto the stage and started directing the play. And centuries later, France and England were still following the script she'd written, sometimes in love, sometimes in war. Her tomb at Fontevraud, with its serene carving of her reading, says it all. Not praying, not ruling, reading. As if even in death she was still looking for the next plot twist. She turned scandal into strategy, love into politics, and herself into a riddle that history still can't stop whispering about. And that's a legacy far louder than any crown.